the much awaited new Mercedes, they could have gone any number of routes, I guess. They could have gone Red Bull route. They could have stayed where they were with that philosophy and developed it based on back half of 2022. What do we see?
Well, I mean, kind of the summary is if you first look at it, I think lots of people that I've seen on social media are kind of seeing it two ways. One, it's not changed much, and one, it's like, well, the advantage is baked in for years, to quote the meme. They've actually evolved what they were doing last year with zero side pods, but in a quite interesting way, and shows us, at least in part, some of the issues that they were having last year and some of the things that teams are needing to do to manage the airflow around these newly shaped cars. So the other big thing I'd take away from initially looking at this car is the amount of details they've got on here. Bearing in mind this is still a launch spec car, and I'm expecting to see some quite different features appearing on it as it starts to race. But looking at the front suspension, the front wing end plates, the floor, even the rear wing, lots of little detail changes on there that shows they've really kind of thrown this kitchen sink at this, as well as changing that kind of side pod concept, which for me is initially the most interesting part of that car. They're completely on their own. Everyone else has kind of created the the slope shouldered side pods of Red Bull Alpine style from last year. Ferrari haven't, Haas to an extent haven't, and Mercedes have kind of kept this zero side pod concept, which obviously was quite controversial last year. Everyone blamed that for all of their problems on track. It wasn't really the case. It led to some other issues for them, but it wasn't really the cause of their porpoising and poor performance. That was more to do with their underfloor, the weight of the car, the flexibility of the floor, stuff like that. So what they've done with the side pods now is actually they look, in some respects, much bigger. So that little tapered inlet they had at the front now is much more vertical. You've still got those two little winglets coming out the front, holding the side impact structure, which I expect to change. But then the side pods seem to be much longer, sort of jelly molded out. And so in lots of respects, they actually look much bigger. Now, I've got no doubt that the radiators inside are still completely squeezed into the side of the car. I'd be quite interested to see the exact orientation of the radiators, because there's some potential they've done something quite different there. But we'll have to see for testing next week when we can have a proper look at the car with the bodywork off. And what this is all about is managing the front tyre wake. So all this turbulence that comes off the front tyre goes back down the car. So what Ferrari do, for instance, have these big wide side pods that pushes that away, keeps it away from going back in towards the diffuser area at the back of the car. What Mercedes have done now is extended this low area of side pod much further back. So it's not like the water slides that you see on the Red Bulls. It's really is kind of just pushing airflow out while still trying to direct some towards the back of the car. It's really quite interesting. And the reason we know that this is really aerodynamic and not because there's more stuff inside the side pods is because they've actually put most of the cooling from the side pods out through these big double-barreled cannons, cooling outlets at the back of the car, which look really dramatic, very different to what everyone else has done, with a really interesting dip, a bit like Ferrari's side pod bathtub, but much higher up on the car. Again, we need to stop and have a really long look at this car to have a look at all the details and work it all out. But what I see is some logical developments of what they did last year around the side pods, managing front tyre wake, directing airflow to the car, the back of the car, and trying to reduce some of the drag that last year's car had and its sensitivity to airflow. So they seem to have done all the right things there. And then, as I say, looked at every other aspect of the car and just tweaked it. So this is, for me, is probably the most interesting, the most complex, the most changed car that we've seen so far.
Last year, Scarbs, at the beginning of last year, the easy to say phrase was that Mercedes had gone the high downforce route, and as a result had suffered more porpoising than anybody else.
Yes.
That was the sort of. But do we think now that in where they've gone with this car, they've had to sacrifice some of that downforce?
No, I don't think. Well, I would say no. I think their philosophy is still very much trying to maximize downforce, and that's done with the shape of the top body, the side pods, and also running very flat, very low to the ground. Now, I was looking at the car that was on the stage and the limited track shots that we had, because they did have some reliability problems yesterday. And the car, and we have to take this at face value, was very flat. It wasn't raked that I could see. It did seem quite high off the ground. So, that's partly because of the way the floor is changed, and also probably because they've just jacked it up to get it on and off stages and things. But, that remains to be seen. But I think they are still going to be one of the cars that sits right on the track. But what they have now is the stiffer floor, the more controlled aerodynamics, the understanding of running a car super low to the ground, and also that they understand now about how much their floor was flexing around as the porpoising started, which just made the whole thing so much worse. So I think the performance we saw out of them in those last few races where the car really was starting to fly, I think you'll see that continued into this new car. And I would expect, that them to make a significant performance jump over this winter, and really be challenging for Red Bull wins, podiums, depending how fast that Ferrari is, which I'm still slightly unsure about.
And retrospectively now, we have to take their hats off to them, because again, the commitment to this car, rather than, for example, to suddenly change everything and go the Red Bull route, would have had to have been made August, September at the latest last year, when they weren't yet flying, as you say.
Yeah.
And they're committed to this philosophy at Mercedes of, this is the car we're going to do, and we're going to do iterations of this over the next 2 or 3 years. We're not going to start chopping and changing and suddenly copying another car. And hats off to them for that. And we were only saying a couple of days ago about how similar the cars are so far, but here's Mercedes doing something very, very different, and it's good to see.
Yeah, and I think this is very much what's in the DNA of Mercedes as a team over these past handful of years. Really diligent engineering, really working hard on the details, not following the pack, and going down their own route. We saw that with the cars, ended in 2021, where they had the long wheelbase super low car, which was totally different to everyone else with high rake, slightly shorter cars. So they've done that. As you say, they didn't panic last year. They just diligently worked through the problem, understood it, saw what changes they could have made during the season last year, which didn't involve the panicked Sidepod change that everyone insisted they did, and have worked out what their root problems are and put that into development for this year. And I think, as you say, hats off to them, and hopefully that will return them to a level of competitiveness that we really didn't see for the majority of last year.